Hello and welcome to another update and analysis on the Luhansk front. I'll be updating what has happened since yesterday, as well as analyzing what the Ukrainian strategy is in Luhansk and how they plan on taking significant cities such as Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and advancing towards the Luhansk city. So starting out with the update on the Luhansk front, we see that the Ukrainians have captured 3 new villages, which are the villages of Nevske, as well as Tverdoholivove and Andrivka, which are all on the Luhansk region, inside the Luhansk region, across the Donetsk border and Kharkiv border. This means that the Ukrainians are now advancing and are straightening out the front line, approaching this highway, which is the one that connects Svatove with Crimea and also supplies all of the nearby regions. This means that Svatove and Crimea are the targets currently for the front line, as the Ukrainians are trying to advance towards the Luhansk region and are advancing towards the major cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. So, how do the Ukrainians plan on taking these cities? It is clear that their objective is these cities, as they are pushing around the Seversk region and trying to capture the surrounding villages. With the pressure that the Russians are exerting on the Bakhmut city as well as the surrounding villages, we see that the Ukrainians are working against the clock here, because we know that there is the Severodonetsk river here to the north of Lysychansk. And if the Russians manage to capture Bakhmut, which is this city here, they have a free rein to push onwards through this highway and cut off the Ukrainian forces here in this area, with this river here cutting them off from the north. We are now in early to mid October. That means that the fall season has really kicked in. The trees leaves will fall and there should be a lot of rain, which will raise the levels of the river. And there's also not a lot of sunlight, which means that the river level will rise and it will not fall as much as it has been falling with the summer, where the sun is shining and there's a lot of hot weather, which decreases the level of the river. So it is easier for the Russians to encircle the forces that Ukrainians have staged in this area, as they are able to cut off this main highway here, which will put pressure on them, as there will be no other main highways. There are other small roads across this area, but the only highway that goes through is this one. And with how there is more rain and less hot weather, it means that most of the ground will be muddy, which will be difficult for the Ukrainians to pull back their heavy equipment through the mud and fall back through that. So there is a danger of encirclement if the Russians manage to capture Bakhmut, which they are achieving a lot of success in the past few days with the capture of Zaitsev and surrounding villages. So that is the danger from the south, which means that the Ukrainians attacking here in the Luhansk region are under time pressure if they want to fight at Lysychansk. The thing is, Russia controls this southern part, so for them to take Lysychansk, they need to cut it off from the south. And the way they do that is by pushing towards 2 major villages here in the south, and we'll detect them by using the supply lines. So these 2 villages are ones that provide supplies towards Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. And as we can see, the 2 villages are Popasna, which is also the main headquarters for the Wagner PMC in Ukraine, and Vrubivka, which connects the supplies from the south as well as the supplies from Luhansk. This means that the Ukrainians must take these 2 villages before they take Lysychansk. So they need to push through this area around Soledar and the surrounding villages and advance towards these 2 villages and capture them, which will cut off Russian supplies towards Lysychansk and Severodonetsk from the south. Then they also need to capture the city of Svatove as well as the villages of Kremina, Shuslava and surrounding areas to cut off the supplies from the north. With this, the Ukrainians will be able to push onwards towards these open fields and cut off and flank the Russian defensive positions by going around them. At the same time, they'll be pushing from the south towards the northern areas and and move towards the Severodonetsk river bank. With that, we can see that there is potential for a pincer maneuver to cut off the Russian forces around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk to capture the cities. So what they want to do is cut off the supply lines, then push onwards to encircle the cities without having to siege them properly, as with a danger of encirclement, the Russians will fall back as they have been doing throughout this war, as they are unwilling to stand and fight their ground. They are much more prone to fall back to avoid casualties and heavy losses. So the dangers the Ukrainian army is facing is two parts. The first part is, of course, the Russian advances around the Bakhmut area, and that they would need to push through this area to reach Popasna and Rubivka from the south. But the second issue is that the Russian partial mobilization will start coming into effect in the next coming days. Most likely this Wednesday we'll start seeing the first forces being moved into Ukraine into the front line. Currently there are a lot of training sessions stated up in areas like Luhansk and Mariupol in the back lines where the Russians are training. There's also some paratrooper training in Melitopol and so on. Generally speaking, the Russians are training a lot of soldiers here in the occupied Ukrainian regions, which means that the Russians are training a lot of soldiers in the annexed Ukrainian regions, which means that they are close to the front line. Once their training has finished, they will be moved to the front line and they will be able to assist the defense and offensive strategies and plans of the Russian army in Ukraine. This means that soon we will see a lot more Russian forces in Ukraine. So for the Ukrainians to achieve success in this eastern area, they will need to fight against time and outrun the Russian army with speed. Now, what would the significance of the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk be? They would be able to cut off all of the supplies here in this area and endanger all the Russian forces here. Then they would be pushing northwards and cut off all the and take back all the territory that Ukrainians have lost here in the north and start a new front line, which would be from this area and towards the city of Luhansk, where they will be fighting around this ring road on the northwestern side, as well as try and hold these positions here to the west, similar to the point of no contact from the start of the war, as well as the whole offensive around Bakhmut having to fall back to their new defensive positions to avoid encirclement, and finally being a huge diplomatic and political blow to the Russian army, since that they have started their partial mobilization, losing two major cities that they have fought many months for, right after losing Izium, Liman, and most of the Kharkiv region. They're only holding on to this small part of the Kharkiv region. With this, it will be a huge blow to the Russian army. However, this operation seems to be very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to pull off, because they have just pulled off 3 major counteroffensives here in the Kharkiv region, taking back Izium and Liman, and now pushing onwards still. They must be very drained and have suffered a lot of casualties from the Russian artillery and airstrike fire, which means that they are decreasing in both momentum, manpower, and equipment, as the Russians are just falling back and losing ground. This means that the Russians are slowly but surely achieving the upper hand in this operation, as Ukraine has very limited ability to further mobilize their population, while the Russians have just started their partial mobilization, which isn't a full mobilization yet, which means that the Ukrainians are looking to be in more and more trouble as times passes on, with the airstrikes that has happened across the country as well, supplies will have a lot of issues, as well as communication between the troops and the commanders, between the commanders and the troops with each other, which means that generally the Ukrainians are in for a lot of trouble in these next coming weeks, as the Russians have stepped up their participation in this war and are now fighting on a larger scale than what we've seen so far. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching and have a great day.